He hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. His boots had holes in both soles. The car he slept in hadn't started in 3 days, and the temperature the night before had dropped to 22 degrees. But when Raymond Kowalski found a wallet in the parking lot of the Sunrise Diner in Clarksburg, West Virginia, containing $2,400 in cash, 4 credit cards, and a federal contractor badge, he walked straight inside and handed it to the woman behind the counter, without hesitating for a single second. She looked at him the way people always looked at him now, like he was a problem to be managed, like he might steal the napkin holders on his way out. He didn't say anything about that. He just set the wallet on the counter, told her he found it in the lot near the dumpsters, and asked if he could use the restroom. She said the restroom was for paying customers only. Raymond nodded. He turned and walked back out into the cold. If you believe that a man's character is measured not by what he has, but by what he does when nobody is watching, type the word honor in the comments right now. Because what happened next in that parking lot, in that diner, and in the weeks that followed, is the kind of story that doesn't get told nearly enough. This is Raymond Kowalski's story. And it starts the way so many veteran stories start. In silence, in the cold, and completely alone. Raymond Allen Kowalski was 51 years old, and he was living out of a 1998 Ford Taurus that hadn't started since the alternator gave out on the 14th of December. He'd parked it in the far corner of the Sunrise Diner lot, because the overnight manager, a soft-spoken Honduran man named Miguel, had told him quietly one evening that he wouldn't call the tow company as long as Raymond kept the area clean and didn't cause any trouble. Raymond had shaken the man's hand with both of his and told him he was grateful. He meant every word of it. Before the Taurus, before Clarksburg, before the string of jobs that didn't work out, the VA appointments that got lost in the system, the rental assistance applications that went unanswered, and the slow, grinding erosion of everything he'd once been. Raymond Kowalski had been a United States Army paratrooper, 82nd Airborne Division. He'd enlisted at 18 out of a small steel town outside of Pittsburgh, where the mill had closed the year before, and the future had started to feel like a door that only swung one way. The Army had opened a different door entirely. He'd gone to basic at Fort Benning. He'd earned his jump wings at the same installation, standing in a line of young men who were about to step out of perfectly functional aircraft for the first time in their lives and somehow convince themselves that this was a good idea. He remembered the sound of the wind when the door opened. He remembered the way the fear in his chest transformed, mid-free fall, into something that felt almost like joy. He'd worn the Airborne tab on his shoulder from that day forward, with the quiet pride of a man who understood exactly what it cost. Over the next decade and a half, Raymond served in ways that didn't always make it into the press releases or the recruiting posters. He did what he was told to do in places whose names he rarely spoke. He came home to Fort Bragg twice with minor wounds that the paperwork classified as non-combat related due to the nature of the operations. He came home a third time with something that didn't show up on any scan or x-ray. The kind of weight that settles into a man's chest in the middle of the night and makes the silence feel hostile and the daylight feel thin. He was medically separated from the Army in 2009 after a physical evaluation board determined that the combination of a partially torn rotator cuff, hearing loss in his left ear, and what the examining psychiatrist carefully described as significant adjustment difficulties rendered him unfit for continued service. He received a disability rating of 30%. He received a handshake, a folder of paperwork, and the address of a VA regional office that would turn out to have a 14-month backlog. He was 35 years old. He had no college degree. He had no civilian work history to speak of. He had a set of skills that the private sector didn't know quite what to do with, unless you were willing to hire yourself out in ways that Raymond wasn't willing to do. He tried construction for a while. He tried security work. He tried driving a delivery truck for a regional logistics company, until the hearing loss made the DOT physical a problem. Each time something ended, it got a little harder to start the next thing. Each time the paperwork at the VA office got lost or rerouted or fell into the gap between one department and another, it cost him a little more of whatever energy he'd been conserving for the fight. By the time he found himself in Clarksburg, West Virginia, Raymond Kowalski had been functionally homeless for 11 months. He had $43 in a checking account he could barely access, because the bank's nearest branch was 20 miles away, and he had no reliable transportation. He had a phone whose screen was cracked in 3 places, and which he kept charged by using the outlet on the exterior wall of the Sunrise Diner at 2 a.m. when no one was watching. He had a jacket that he'd bought at a Salvation Army thrift store in Morgantown, a faded olive field jacket from some other veteran's life, with a unit patch still sewn onto the left sleeve. He didn't know what unit it was. He just knew it was a patch from a brother, and that meant it deserved to be worn with respect. He ate when the diner put out its leftover breakfast items in a bag by the back door at 9:30 in the morning. He ate again when he could scrape together enough for a coffee and the refills that came with it, and the little plastic tub of peanut butter crackers that cost $1.49. He was not ashamed of how he was living because he didn't have the luxury of shame anymore. Shame was something you carried when you still had enough left over to carry something extra. Raymond was travelling light. On the morning of January 9th, at approximately 7:45, Raymond was walking the perimeter of the Sunrise Diner parking lot the way he did most mornings, partly to stay warm, partly out of a habit of situational awareness that 17 years of military service had made as automatic as breathing. The morning was grey and brittle. A light skiff of snow had come down overnight and the asphalt had that particular blue-white look that meant the temperature hadn't climbed above freezing yet. He found the wallet near the dumpster enclosure, half tucked under the wheel stop at the edge of a parking space. Brown leather, expensive, the kind of wallet that had been used long enough to develop real character, worn at the corners, soft in the middle, with a slight lean from years of sitting in the same back pocket. He picked it up. He stood there for a moment in the cold with it in his hands. He didn't open it right away. He stood with it, and he thought about his $43 and his cracked phone and the alternator that was going to cost him somewhere between $200 and $400, depending on who he could get to look at it and whether they'd be willing to work something out. He stood there and he let himself feel, very briefly and very honestly, what it would mean to have whatever was in this wallet. Then he opened it. $2,400. He counted it twice, 12 crisp hundreds and 6 50s, tucked neatly in the main billfold with the practiced organisation of a man who kept his affairs in order. 4 credit cards, 2 Visas, an American Express, and what appeared to be a corporate purchasing card from a company called Meridian Defense Solutions, a driver's license belonging to one Colonel James B. Whitmore, retired, address in McLean, Virginia, with a date of birth that put him at 63 years old. A federal contractor ID badge from Meridian Defense Solutions with a photo of a man who looked like he'd spent significant portions of his life outdoors in difficult circumstances and had come to a comfortable terms with that fact, and tucked behind the license, folded into a small square with the careful, deliberate folding of something that mattered, a photograph. Raymond didn't look at the photograph for long. It wasn't his to look at. He folded the wallet closed and walked inside. The woman behind the counter was named Deborah. She'd seen Raymond before, the way you see someone who's always in the corner of your vision without ever quite being in the centre of it. She watched him approach the counter with the expression of someone preparing to deliver a policy. He set the wallet on the formica and told her he'd found it in the parking lot near the dumpsters and that someone should probably call the number on the ID before the owner cancelled his cards. Deborah looked at the wallet. She looked at Raymond. She picked up the wallet and checked the ID and then looked at Raymond again with a slightly different expression. Not warm exactly, but recalibrated. "That's a lot of cash to just hand over," she said. "It's not my cash," Raymond said. He asked about the restroom. She told him it was for paying customers. He nodded and walked out. He didn't think much more about it. That was the honest truth of it. He didn't walk back to the Taurus and sit with the nobility of what he'd just done or compose a narrative about his own integrity. He walked back to the car and sat in the cold and tried to figure out if there was any realistic chance of getting enough work in the next 2 weeks to cover the cost of the alternator before Miguel's patience ran out, or the weather got bad enough that the car stopped being a viable shelter entirely. He was still sitting there, running numbers against a set of options that didn't add up no matter how he arranged them, when the black SUV pulled into the lot at 11:47 that morning. James Whitmore had driven 4 hours from McLean, Virginia, after Deborah from the Sunrise Diner called the number on his contractor badge and told him a man had turned in a wallet with $2,400 in it, and could he please come collect it as she didn't feel right about just mailing it with that much cash inside. He'd been halfway to a meeting at the Pentagon when he got the call. He'd turned around without much deliberation about it. The wallet contained things that couldn't be replaced by cancelling a card or withdrawing cash from an ATM, and he was not a man who left things unfinished. He was built the way men who've spent careers in special forces are often built, not exceptionally large, but with a density and economy of movement that suggested the absence of anything unnecessary. His hair was silver and cut short in the way that never entirely left you once the army got to it. He wore a grey wool overcoat and carried himself the way men carry themselves when they've been in enough rooms where the decisions were serious enough that posture became a form of communication. He went inside. He got the wallet from Deborah. He asked about the man who turned it in. Deborah described Raymond. She described him accurately and without particular warmth, noting that he seemed to be living out of the vehicle in the far corner of the lot, that the overnight manager had apparently been letting him stay there, and that she personally felt the situation needed to be addressed by the property manager before it became a liability issue. Whitmore listened to all of this without expression. He thanked her. He left a 20 on the counter for her trouble. He walked out of the diner and crossed the parking lot toward the far corner, where a faded blue Ford Taurus sat with frost still on the roof. Raymond saw him coming. He watched through the cracked windshield as the man in the grey overcoat walked across the lot with the kind of purposeful, unhurried stride that Raymond associated with people who had spent long enough in high-consequence environments that they'd stopped performing urgency and simply became it. He didn't feel alarmed. He felt something closer to a strange, quiet attention, the way you feel when something important is happening and you don't yet know what it is. Whitmore stopped a respectful distance from the driver's side window. Raymond rolled it down. It still worked. That was one of the few things that still worked. "Mr. Kowalski," Whitmore said. Raymond looked at him. "That's me. I'm Jim Whitmore. I believe you found my wallet this morning." "Yes, sir." Whitmore studied him for a moment. Not the way Deborah had studied him, not with that particular calculation of risk and liability, but with the focused attention of a man taking genuine inventory. His eyes moved across Raymond's face down to the jacket and stopped. "Where'd you get that patch?" he said. Raymond glanced down at the left sleeve of the field jacket. The unit patch, faded gold and black, some kind of airborne insignia he'd never looked up. "Thrift store," Raymond said. "Morgantown. Figured it belonged to somebody who earned it. Didn't want to see it go in the bin." Whitmore was quiet for a moment. "That's a patch from the 7th Special Forces Group," he said. "Panama. I served alongside a company out of that group in 1989 during Just Cause." He paused. "What's your background, Mr. Kowalski?" Raymond looked at him steadily. 82nd Airborne, 14 years, some additional assignments I'm not going to talk about in a parking lot. Something shifted in Whitmore's expression. Not dramatics. The man clearly wasn't built for dramatics, but a subtle realignment, the way a compass needle settles when it finds true north. "Can I buy you a cup of coffee?" he said. Raymond almost said no. He would think about that later. How close he came to just saying no, the way you learn to say no to things when accepting them has cost you too much in the past. But something about the steadiness of the man's tone, the absence of performance or pity in it, made him say yes instead. They went back into the diner. Deborah watched them come in together with visible confusion. Whitmore chose a booth in the back. He ordered 2 coffees, 2 breakfasts, and a plate of toast, and he told the waitress to keep refilling the coffee without being asked. He said it with the quiet authority of a man who was accustomed to logistics being handled efficiently. They sat. For the first few minutes neither of them said much. That was fine. Raymond had noticed over the course of his life that men who'd operated in certain contexts had a particular relationship with silence. They didn't feel obliged to fill it, and its presence between 2 people didn't read as hostility, but rather as something closer to mutual respect. Whitmore asked about the 82nd. Raymond talked about it briefly, the way you talk about the important things when you're out of practice talking at all. A little haltingly, a little flat in the effect, but with the vocabulary of someone who knew the material from the inside. He mentioned Fort Bragg. He mentioned the rotator cuff. He mentioned the evaluation board. Whitmore listened without interruption. He'd heard variations of this story before. He'd watched it happen to men he'd served beside, the way the institution that had shaped them completely could, at the point of separation, sometimes seem almost indifferent to what came next. He had opinions about that which he kept to himself for the moment. "Your VA claim," he said. "What's the current status?" Raymond laughed once, short and without humour. "Current status is 2019. That's the last time I had a case number I could actually track. After that I moved twice, and I think the correspondence went to addresses I wasn't at anymore, and I didn't have a stable phone number for about 8 months. And somewhere in there the whole thing just..." He made a gesture with his hand, a dispersal. Whitmore nodded slowly. He picked up his coffee. "What's your disability rating?" 30% as of separation. Rotator cuff and hearing loss. That's it? Raymond looked at him. That's what they gave me. What about the psychiatric evaluation? A pause. Adjustment difficulties, Raymond said. That's the language they used, which means PTSD that they didn't want to fully rate because the operations were classified and documenting the specific sources of the trauma would have required. He stopped. It was complicated. It's always complicated, Whitmore said, until someone makes it uncomplicated. He set down his coffee. He looked at Raymond directly, and he said something that Raymond would think about many times in the months that followed, because it was delivered not as a promise or a performance, but as a plain statement of intent from a man who had apparently decided something during the walk across the parking lot. I owe you $2,400 that you didn't take, Whitmore said. I'm not going to insult you by handing you cash in a diner, but I'm going to ask you some questions, and I'm going to make some phone calls, and I want you to understand that the calls I'm going to make are to people who will actually pick up, because I've worked alongside them for 30 years, and that's what that's worth. Is that acceptable to you? Raymond looked at him for a long moment. He'd been a long time without someone asking him things that were actually going to turn into actions. He'd learned to be careful about the difference between the people who asked and the people who did. He said, "What are the questions?" The questions took most of the morning. Whitmore had a legal pad in his coat, the kind of detail that told Raymond something about the man, that he still carried paper, that he still thought in terms of notes that couldn't be edited after the fact. And he wrote things down as Raymond talked. Not everything, but the key items, dates, unit designations, the specific language on the medical separation paperwork, which Raymond could still recite nearly verbatim because it had been important once, and things that had been important once don't always leave you even when you want them to. The names of the VA offices he'd been through, the last known case numbers, the addresses where correspondence had gone missing. Whitmore wrote it down. He asked clarifying questions without affect, the way someone who is genuinely trying to solve a problem asks questions rather than the way someone who is performing concern asks them. He ate his breakfast methodically. He refilled his coffee twice. When Raymond had told him everything that seemed relevant, Whitmore capped his pen and looked at the legal pad for a moment. Meridian Defense Solutions, he said, naming his own company. We do systems integration work primarily for SOCOM and some interagency clients. I have 14 employees who came to me from backgrounds like yours. Some of them were in worse shape than you when I found them. He said it without fanfare. We have a facility operations manager position open right now at our office in Herndon, Virginia. The work is unclassified logistics coordination. The pay starts at $62,000. We provide full health coverage, dental, vision, and a 401k with a 4% match. He looked at Raymond. Can you manage a facility and coordinate logistics? Raymond stared at him. I manage logistics for a forward operating base with 200 personnel in... He stopped. Yes, he said. I can manage a facility and coordinate logistics. I assumed? Whitmore said. Second item. I have a one-bedroom apartment in a building in Herndon that I own outright. It was being used by a former employee who relocated to Colorado in November. It's furnished, utilities are included in what I charge, and what I charge is $600 a month until you're stabilized and then we renegotiate to market rate. You'd have first right of refusal when we renegotiate. He paused. Third item. I have a VA-accredited attorney on retainer who has spent the last 12 years doing nothing but veteran benefits cases. She's recovered aggregate back pay for my employees in excess of $3 million. Some of those cases were as cold as yours. She'll take your case without a fee because she works on contingency, and I'll cover the contingency cost personally if it doesn't resolve in your favour. Another pause. Do you have any questions about any of those three items? Raymond was quiet for a long time. Outside the diner windows, the morning had gone a shade brighter. Thin winter sunlight coming through the overcast in the particular way it does in West Virginia in January. Not warm exactly, but present. Definite. Proof that it was still there. Why? Raymond said. Whitmore looked at him. Because you found a wallet with $2,400 in it when you had $40 to your name and nowhere to sleep, and you walked into a diner and handed it to a woman who was rude to you. That tells me something about your character. And I have been in the business of evaluating character in difficult conditions for 35 years, and I trust my evaluations. He picked up his coffee. Also, frankly, because you're sitting here in a jacket with a 7th group patch on it, and you've been sleeping in a parking lot, and that is a failure of systems that I have the ability to partially correct. And it's been my experience that when you have the ability to correct something and you don't, it corrects something in you instead, not for the better. Raymond sat with all of that for a moment. Then he said, "The photograph in your wallet. The folded one." Whitmore's expression shifted slightly. Not open, but not closed either. He nodded. "It's my son," Whitmore said. "He was Special Forces. He died in 2011, Wardak Province." A pause that had weight to it. "It's the only photograph I have of him in uniform where he's laughing. I don't know what was funny. I keep meaning to ask someone who was there." Raymond looked at the table. He looked at his coffee. He looked at the man across from him with the silver hair and the grey overcoat and the legal pad, and the 3 items that he'd laid out like a set of coordinates on a map. "I'm sorry about your son," Raymond said. "Thank you," Whitmore said. That was all either of them said about it. Some things are too serious for more words, and both of them knew that. They finished their coffee. Whitmore paid. He left Deborah a tip that was larger than she deserved, and he did it without any evident awareness of irony. In the parking lot, Whitmore shook Raymond's hand and then held it for a moment. "I need to ask you to hold tight for about 4 hours," he said. "I'm going to make some calls from the car. I want to have actual commitments in place before I give you specific dates and names, because I'd rather take more time and give you something real than give you something fast and have it fall apart." He looked at Raymond steadily. "Is that acceptable?" Raymond thought about the alternator. He thought about the temperature forecast. He thought about Miguel, the overnight manager, and the quiet grace of a man who looked the other way when someone needed a place to park. "I'll be here," he said. He was. Whitmore sat in his SUV for 4 hours and 11 minutes. Raymond could see him through the windshield, phone to his ear, the legal pad on the steering wheel occasionally writing something down. He called, Raymond would later learn, 7 people in that time. The VA-accredited attorney, whose name was Patricia Olson and who had once been a JAG officer, and who would later describe Raymond's case as one of the most straightforward benefits recovery cases she'd handled, complicated only by the classified service records that she would spend 6 weeks obtaining, through channels that required Whitmore's security clearances to navigate. The property manager at the Herndon building, who agreed to have the apartment prepped and inspected by end of week. The HR director at Meridian Defense Solutions, a former Army logistics officer named Carla Dunbar, who would interview Raymond by phone 2 days later and hire him 3 days after that. A retired colonel from USSO COM who owed Whitmore enough favours to make 2 additional calls on Raymond's behalf to offices within the VA Regional Center in Martinsburg that had the authority to restart dormant cases and flag them for expedited processing. A private social services organisation in Clarksburg that Whitmore had previously funded anonymously, which agreed to provide Raymond with a motel room for the next 2 weeks while the apartment was being prepared. And Miguel, the overnight manager of the Sunrise Diner, whose last name turned out to be Estrada, and who Whitmore called to thank personally, and who Whitmore would send a handwritten note to the following week, a detail that Raymond didn't learn about until much later. When Whitmore came back to the Taurus, he handed Raymond a piece of paper with 7 items on it. Each item had a name, a phone number, and a brief description of what that person had agreed to do and when. It was organised the way a military operations order is organised, clear, sequential, with contingencies noted and responsibilities assigned. Raymond read it twice. "This is real," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a man recalibrating. "It's real," Whitmore confirmed. Raymond looked at the paper. He looked at the diner. He thought about the morning, the cold, the wallet, the woman who wouldn't let him use the restroom, the walk back to the car. He thought about all the mornings before it, and the particular way time passes when the future has contracted to a series of immediate problems with no visible horizon beyond them. He thought about a jump door opening somewhere over North Carolina 23 years ago, and the sound of the wind and the transformation of fear into something that felt like joy. "I need to tell Miguel," Raymond said, "about the motel so he doesn't worry about the car." Whitmore nodded. "I already called him," he said. "He said to tell you that the car can stay as long as it needs to, and that if you want, he knows a mechanic in town who might look at the alternator for parts cost only." Raymond looked away. He looked at the sky over the parking lot, that thin January light that proved the sun was still there without quite committing to warmth. "Okay," he said. His voice was level. It was the voice of a man who's been a long time in control of his reactions, and is not going to stop being in control of them now, just because something good is happening. "Okay." The weeks that followed were not simple. They were better than anything Raymond had experienced in a long time, which is not the same thing as being simple. There was paperwork, more paperwork than any civilian undertaking should reasonably require, and Patricia Olson navigated it with the systematic intensity of someone who had stopped finding bureaucratic obstruction surprising and had simply developed effective responses to each variant of it. There was the phone interview with Carla Dunbar, which Raymond approached the way he'd approached every evaluation in his military career, prepared, direct, and without embellishment, and which she would later tell him was the most straightforward hiring interview she'd conducted in 14 years of HR work. There was the apartment in Herndon, which was small and clean and had a window that looked out onto a parking lot with a few scraggly trees that would, the building manager told him, be quite something in the spring. Raymond stood in the middle of it the first night and was very still for a long time. Not overcome, he was not a man given to being overcome, but taking measure of a thing that deserved to be measured carefully. There was the first day at Meridian Defense Solutions, where Raymond wore a button-down shirt that Patricia Olson's assistant had helped him find at a thrift store in Herndon, and where he was introduced to the 14 other employees by Carla Dunbar as their new facility operations manager. 7 of the 14 had backgrounds that overlapped with his in ways that didn't need to be spoken about explicitly. He could see it in their posture, in the particular economy of their movements, in the way they shook his hand with the full grip that you learn in places where handshakes still mean something. He felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, the particular comfort of being in a room with people who operated from similar premises without needing to explain what those premises were. Patricia Olson filed his VA claim with the supporting documentation in the 4th week. The classified service records arrived through Whitmore's channels in the 6th week, and she spent 3 days with them before calling Raymond to tell him that his disability rating was, in her professional opinion, going to be substantially revised upward and that she expected the back pay calculation to be significant. She said significant in the tone of someone being deliberately conservative with a number they were actually quite confident about. The final rating, issued 14 weeks after the claim was filed, was 80%. The back pay, calculated from the date of his original separation, was $67,420. Raymond sat in Patricia Olson's office when she told him. He sat very still and looked at the wall for a moment and then looked back at her. "How?" he said. "PTSD, documented through the classified operational records," she said. 2 service-connected injuries with functional limitations that were underrated at separation. Sleep disorder secondary to the PTSD. Tinnitus from the hearing damage, which they originally folded into the hearing loss rating but which should have been rated separately. She said it with the precise satisfaction of someone who is good at their work and knows it. "It should have been done right the first time." "It should have," Raymond agreed. "A lot of them should have," she said. "That's why I do this." He called Whitmore that evening. Not to express gratitude in some large way. Raymond was not built for large expressions and Whitmore would not have wanted them, but because the man had made it possible, and that deserved to be acknowledged. "Patricia told me," Whitmore said. "Good outcome." "Yes, sir." A pause. "How's the job going?" "It's good," Raymond said. "The work is real. The people are real." Another pause. "I think I might be good at it." "I know you're good at it," Whitmore said. "Carla's already asking me about fast-tracking you to a senior operations role." Raymond was quiet for a moment. Outside the window of the Herndon apartment, the parking lot was dark and the scraggly trees were moving slightly in a wind that wasn't cold enough anymore to be dangerous. "The photograph," Raymond said. "Your son. What was his name?" "Daniel," Whitmore said. "Danny." "I'll remember that," Raymond said. There was a particular kind of silence that settled between them then. Not awkward, not sad, but respectful. The silence of 2 men who understood something about cost and something about continuity, and something about the stubborn, unglamorous work of honouring the people who didn't make it back by remaining functional among the people who did. "Get some sleep," Whitmore said. "Yes, sir," Raymond said. He did. What happened to Raymond Kowalski in that parking lot in Clarksburg, West Virginia, in January of a year that had started with him sleeping in a car with no heat and no plan, is not a miracle. That's important to understand. It is not a miracle, and it is not a fairy tale, and it is not the kind of story that happens because the universe occasionally decides to reward virtue with the theatrical timing of a Hollywood script. It's a story about a man who did the right thing because he knew no other way to do things, and about another man who saw that clearly enough to respond to it proportionally. It's a story about what becomes possible when the right connection happens to get made. Because here is the number that matters most in Raymond Kowalski's story. And it is not $67,000 in back pay, and it is not the 80% disability rating, and it is not the $62,000 salary or the furnished apartment, or the 4% 401k match. The number is this. According to the National Alliance to End Homelessness, on any given night in the United States there are approximately 33,000 homeless veterans. According to the Veterans Benefits Administration, as of the most recent data available, more than 100,000 veterans have claims that have been in processing for more than 125 days. The Government Accountability Office has found repeatedly that veterans with service-connected PTSD related to classified operations face particular barriers in having those conditions properly rated because the documentation required to support their claims requires security clearances to access. Raymond was not an outlier. Raymond was not uniquely unlucky or uniquely fallen. Raymond was one of tens of thousands of men and women who served in ways that qualified them for benefits they are not receiving, living in circumstances that their service did not earn them, one connection away from a different outcome. Most of them will never meet a Jim Whitmore in a parking lot. Most of them will never have a Patricia Olson working their case. Most of them will never find a wallet at precisely the right moment that sets in motion the sequence of events that changes what's possible. But some of them will, and the difference, in every case, is a person who looks past the jacket and the cracked windshield and the untrimmed beard and asks the right questions and then makes the calls. Raymond still works at Meridian Defense Solutions. He was promoted to Senior Operations Manager 14 months after he was hired. He has since used his position, and more specifically his relationship with Jim Whitmore and the network that comes with it, to help identify 3 other veterans in the Northern Virginia area whose benefits situations resembled his own, and to connect them with Patricia Olson's office. One of those 3 cases has already resolved. The other 2 are pending. He still has the field jacket with the 7th group patch. He doesn't wear it to work. He keeps it on a hook by the apartment door, the way you keep something that reminds you of where you came from and what it cost and what it meant. On the nights when the window in the Herndon apartment shows the parking lot trees moving in a wind that has some edge to it, he sometimes stands by the door and looks at the patch for a moment before he goes to bed. He thinks about the jump door opening over North Carolina. He thinks about the transformation of fear into something that felt like joy. He thinks about Danny Whitmore laughing in a photograph for reasons nobody could explain. He goes to bed. He sleeps. He gets up in the morning and he goes back to work, because that is what you do. That is what you always do. You find the wallet, you hand it in, you sit in the cold and you run the numbers and they don't add up and you do it again the next day. You hold on to the patch from the brother you never met. You accept the coffee when a man with a legal pad and a look in his eyes that you've learned to trust asks you if you want a cup. You answer the questions, you do the work, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the door opens. If Raymond Kowalski's story reminded you that the people who served us deserve more than our assumptions and our parking lot policies and our restrooms for paying customers only, if it reminded you that character doesn't announce itself and that worth doesn't expire with a DD214, then subscribe to this channel. Because this is what we do here. We find the stories that don't get told loudly enough. We sit with them. We give them the room they deserve. Every veteran who ever handed back something they could have kept. Every man and woman who maintained their integrity when the world gave them no particular reason to, deserves to have someone paying attention. Subscribe and be the person paying attention. That's all any of us can do. That's everything any of us can do.